The heavy, humid air of the kitchen at the Dragon's Pavilion felt like a weight on Marcus Miller's shoulders as he leaned over his workstation. At 45, Marcus moved with the practiced, quiet efficiency of a man who had spent more time holding a knife than a conversation. His faded chef's coat, once a crisp white, was now a map of stubborn stains and frayed edges, much like the man himself. He didn't look like a culinary master. He looked like a man who had been beaten down by life and had finally stopped fighting back. Every morning at 5, he was the first to arrive, his calloused fingers meticulously julienning vegetables with a precision that the younger, flashier cooks couldn't hope to match. Yet, to the front of house staff and the elite clientele on the other side of the swinging mahogany doors, Marcus was invisible. He was the ghost in the machine, the laborer whose sweat seasoned the $50 plates, while someone else's name was printed on the menu. The quiet hum of the prep line was shattered by the sharp, rhythmic clicking of Italian leather shoes on the tile floor. Marcus didn't need to look up to know that Mr. Chen had arrived. The owner of the pavilion didn't just walk into a room. He occupied it, radiating a frantic, arrogant energy that made the air feel thin. Chen was draped in a charcoal gray suit that cost more than Marcus's yearly rent, his hair slicked back to a perfect sheen. He moved through the kitchen like a king inspecting a peasant colony, his nose wrinkled as if the very smell of cooking was beneath him. He was shouting into a gold-cased smartphone in Mandarin, his voice a sharp staccato of demands and insults, before snapping it shut and slamming it onto a prep table. The tension in the room spiked as Chen's eyes landed on a tray of braised bok choy. He didn't say a word at first. He simply loomed over Marcus, his presence a dark cloud. Then, the explosion came. A VIP customer in the main dining room had complained that the Golden Phoenix soup, the restaurant's signature dish, was slightly undersalted. To Chen, this wasn't just a culinary error, it was a personal affront to his brand. He didn't care that Marcus had been working a double shift or that the kitchen was short-staffed. He saw a target. "Do you even have a brain in that thick skull of yours?" Chen's voice hissed, dangerously low before erupting into a scream. He grabbed the silver tureen of soup from a nearby server's tray and held it inches from Marcus's face. "I pay you to cook, not to ruin my reputation with this bland, tasteless garbage. Look at you. You're just like the rest of your people, lazy, unrefined, and completely devoid of any real palate. You think because you're in a nice kitchen you're a chef? You're a glorified dishwasher who got lucky." Marcus kept his head down, his eyes fixed on the cutting board, his knuckles white as he gripped his paring knife. He didn't defend himself. He didn't point out that he had followed the recipe exactly as Chen had commanded. The silence only seemed to enrage Chen further. The owner let out a mocking laugh, looking around at the other staff members who were now frozen in place, staring at the floor to avoid becoming the next victim. "You want to play the silent martyr?" Chen sneered. He tilted the tureen, and for a second, time seemed to slow. The steaming, golden liquid poured out in a slow, viscous stream, drenching Marcus's workstation. It soaked into the piles of freshly prepped vegetables, ruined the delicate garnishes Marcus had spent the last hour carving, and splattered across his worn boots. "Clean it up. And when you're done, you're going to walk out there, find that guest, and get on your knees. You tell them you're a low-class amateur who doesn't deserve to be in their presence. If you don't, you can find a cardboard box to live in by tonight. Do you understand me, you pathetic piece of trash?" Marcus felt the heat of the soup through his thin trousers, but the sting on his skin was nothing compared to the cold, hard knot forming in his chest. He looked at the ruined work, the result of hours of soul-crushing labor, now a puddle on the floor. He finally looked up, meeting Chen's dark, mocking eyes. There was no anger in Marcus's gaze, only a deep, terrifyingly calm realization. He had spent months waiting to see a glimmer of humanity in the man standing before him, but all he found was a void of greed and vanity. The storm had finally arrived, and as the rest of the kitchen staff watched in horrified silence, Marcus knew the time for hiding was over. The fluorescent lights of the modern kitchen seemed to flicker and fade, the sounds of Mr. Chen's shouting dissolving into a muffled roar as Marcus's mind drifted back 20 years. He wasn't in San Francisco anymore. He was in the heart of Paris, standing in the prestigious Le Grand Lys Academy. The air there didn't smell like resentment and cheap cleaning chemicals. It smelled of expensive butter, fresh thyme, and the heavy, metallic scent of high-grade copper. A younger Marcus stood at a station, his eyes bright with ambition, his movements fluid and confident. He wasn't the ghost in the machine back then, he was the star. Beside him stood the legendary Chef Li, Mr. Chen's father, a man whose hands were mapped with the wisdom of 1,000 recipes. Li didn't look at Marcus as an employee, he looked at him with the pride of a father who had finally found a son worthy of his legacy. Marcus remembered the way Chef Li would place a hand on his shoulder, ignoring his own biological son, who stood fuming at a nearby station. The young Mr. Chen, even then, was draped in the finest clothes money could buy, but his knife skills were clumsy and his heart was cold. Chef Li would often sigh, his voice a low rumble as he spoke to Marcus in the quiet of the after-hours kitchen. He told Marcus that a true chef doesn't cook with his hands, but with his soul. He whispered that Marcus possessed a rare gift, the ability to understand the balance of flavors as if they were notes in a symphony. Meanwhile, Chen would watch from the shadows, his eyes burning with a toxic mixture of jealousy and entitlement. To Chen, the culinary world was a throne he was born to inherit. To Marcus, it was a sanctuary he had earned through blood and sweat. The memory shifted, turning dark and jagged, smelling of smoke and melting plastic. It was the night of the final examinations, the moment that was supposed to cement Marcus's future. He had stayed late to perfect his signature broth, but as he stepped away to the pantry, a shadow moved near his station. A sudden, violent burst of orange flame roared toward the ceiling. The younger Chen had intentionally knocked over a vat of highly flammable oil near a burner, his face illuminated by the fire for a split second before he vanished into the night. Marcus had rushed back, desperately trying to save the kitchen and his work, the heat searing the skin on the back of his hand as he fought the blaze. But by the time the instructors arrived, the damage was done. Chen stood among the crowd, pointing a trembling, fake frightened finger at Marcus, accusing him of reckless negligence. In an instant, Marcus's world collapsed. Chef Li, broken-hearted and pressured by his son's calculated lies, had no choice but to expel his protege to protect the school's reputation. Marcus was stripped of his credentials, blacklisted from every major kitchen in Europe, and left with nothing but a permanent scar on his hand and a hollow ache in his chest. For years, he lived in the gray margins of the world, losing his sense of smell to the trauma and drifting from one low-paying job to another, eventually landing in the very city where his old rival had opened a flagship restaurant. He had taken the job at the Dragon's Pavilion not out of desperation, but as a test. He wanted to see if 2 decades had softened the edges of the boy who had ruined him. The present rushed back with the force of a physical blow as the cold soup continued to drip from the table onto Marcus's boots. He looked down at the pale, jagged scar on his hand, the one he had hidden under his sleeve for months. The heat of the soup felt like a ghost of the fire that had stolen his life 20 years ago. Across from him, Mr. Chen was still sneering, his face twisted in that same familiar expression of smug superiority he had worn while watching the academy burn. Chen had no idea that the man he was currently calling white trash was the very person who had taught him everything he knew about flavor, the man whose genius he had been trying and failing to mimic for his entire career. Marcus straightened his back, the weight of the years seemingly lifting for a moment. The humility he had worn like a cloak was beginning to fray. He looked at Chen, really looked at him, and saw the truth. Chen was a small man living in a giant shadow. Behind the designer suit and the expensive watch, he was still that clumsy, jealous boy who couldn't even balance a simple broth. Every insult Chen hurled was a reflection of his own inadequacy. The tension in the kitchen was no longer just about a spilled bowl of soup. It was the rekindling of a fire that had been smoldering for 2 decades. Standing nearby was Sarah, a young waitress who had been watching the humiliation with tears welling in her eyes. She reached out a hand as if to offer Marcus a towel, but Chen barked at her to get back to work. "Don't touch him, Sarah. You'll catch whatever failure he's got," Chen spat, clicking his tongue in disgust. He turned back to Marcus, leaning in so close that Marcus could smell the expensive, cloying cologne. I don't know why my father ever spoke your name with respect. You're a nothing, Marcus. You were born a nothing, and you'll die a nothing in my kitchen. Marcus didn't blink. He didn't move. He simply stared into Chen's eyes with a chilling, silent intensity that made the owner's smirk falter for a fraction of a second. The past was no longer a memory, it was a weapon. Marcus realized that his silence hadn't been a sign of defeat, but a period of observation. He had seen the books, he knew the suppliers, and he knew exactly how hollow the foundation of Chen's empire really was. As Chen turned away to bark orders at another terrified cook, Marcus felt a cold, sharp clarity settle over him. The time for suffering in the shadows was over. If Chen wanted to treat life like a game of power, Marcus was finally ready to show him exactly who the master of the house really was. The following week at the Dragon's Pavilion felt like walking through a minefield during a thunderstorm. Mr. Chen had announced his entry into the Global Culinary Shield, the most prestigious competition in the industry, and the pressure had turned the kitchen into a pressure cooker of resentment. Chen didn't just want to win, he wanted to dominate, and he knew his own skills were a fraud. He cornered Marcus in the walk-in freezer, the cold air swirling around them like a premonition. With a predatory grin, Chen tossed a thick manila folder onto a crate of expensive sea urchins. He demanded that Marcus develop a 7-course tasting menu that would redefine modern Asian cuisine. He wanted Marcus to be the ghost, the phantom hand behind the plates, while Chen stood in the spotlight for the cameras. For this monumental task, which would secure Chen's fortune for a decade, he flicked a $500 check toward Marcus as if he were tossing a scrap of meat to a stray dog. "Take it and be grateful," Chen hissed, his breath hitching in the cold. "And don't get any ideas about credit. If one word of your name escapes these walls, I'll make sure you're blacklisted so hard you won't even be able to flip burgers in a gas station. You're a ghost, Marcus. Ghosts don't have names." The atmosphere grew even more toxic with the constant presence of Brad, the sous chef and Chen's loyal lapdog. Brad was the kind of man who wore his mediocrity like a badge of honor, constantly brown-nosing Chen while making Marcus's life a living hell. He spent the afternoon making loud, derogatory comments about old-school white guys, trying to steal space in an authentic kitchen. Every time Marcus moved, Brad was there to bump his shoulder or, accidentally, knock over a container of prep work. The injustice reached its boiling point during the Friday evening rush. A shipment of rare Italian white truffles, worth thousands of dollars, had gone missing from the dry storage. Chen stormed into the kitchen, his face a mask of performative outrage. He didn't check the cameras. He didn't ask questions. He walked straight to Marcus's locker and kicked the door open. With a flourish that felt rehearsed, Brad reached into the bottom of Marcus's duffel bag and pulled out a small, velvet-lined box containing the missing truffles. The kitchen went deathly silent. Marcus stared at the box, his heart hammering against his ribs, not with fear, but with a cold, sharpening clarity. He knew he hadn't touched them. He saw the smug, self-satisfied glint in Brad's eyes and the way Chen's lip curled in a rehearsed sneer. It was a setup, as clumsy and transparent as the fire in Paris 20 years ago. "I knew it," Chen roared, his voice carrying out into the dining room where elite guests began to whisper. "A thief. I give you a job, I give you a second chance, and you repay my generosity by stealing from me? You're not just a failure, Marcus. You're a criminal." Chen grabbed Marcus by the collar of his faded chef's coat, the fabric straining under the tension. He dragged him toward the back exit, past the line of chefs who all looked away, paralyzed by the fear of losing their own livelihoods. Marcus searched for a single friendly face, a single voice to stand up for the truth. He saw Sarah, the young waitress, standing by the dish pit. Her face was pale, her hands trembling as she clutched a bus tub. She had seen Brad sneak into the locker room earlier that morning with the velvet box. She opened her mouth to speak, but Chen caught her eye, giving her a look so chilling and filled with professional malice that the words died in her throat. She looked down, tears of shame hitting the floor, leaving Marcus completely isolated in the middle of his own public execution. At the back door, Chen shoved Marcus out into the damp, oil-slicked alleyway. "Don't bother coming back for your final check," Chen spat, wiping his hands on a silk handkerchief as if Marcus were contagious. "I'm filing a police report, and I'm calling every owner in the city." "You're done, Marcus. You're finished. Go back to whatever gutter you crawled out of." The heavy steel door slammed shut with a finality that echoed off the brick walls. Marcus stood alone in the rain, his few belongings scattered at his feet. He looked up at the glowing neon sign of the Dragon's Pavilion, the red light reflecting in the puddles like blood. He wasn't crying. He wasn't begging. He slowly reached down and picked up his roll of professional knives, the only things he truly owned. The humiliation was a fire, but this time, Marcus wasn't going to let it burn him. He was going to use it to forge something far more dangerous. He turned his back on the restaurant and walked into the shadows of the city, the ghost, finally ready to haunt the man who thought he had killed him. The cold rain of San Francisco felt like needles against Marcus's neck as he stood in the dim glow of the alleyway's flickering security light. To anyone passing by, he looked like a broken man, a mid-career failure clutching a roll of knives like a lifeline while his dignity washed down the gutter. He watched the heavy steel door of the Dragon's Pavilion, listening to the muffled sounds of laughter and clinking glassware from within, knowing that Mr. Chen was likely inside raising a glass to his own perceived brilliance. But as Marcus turned away from the brick walls, he didn't head for a bus stop or a homeless shelter. He walked toward the corner of the block where a sleek, obsidian-black Cadillac Escalade sat idling, its tinted windows reflecting the city lights like a polished gemstone. As Marcus approached, the driver's side door opened, and a man in a crisp suit stepped out, holding a large umbrella to shield Marcus from the downpour. The driver didn't look at Marcus with pity or disgust. He looked at him with profound deference. "Rough night at the office, Mr. Miller?" the driver asked softly. Marcus climbed into the plush, leather-scented sanctuary of the backseat, the door closing with a solid, expensive thud that silenced the world outside. He wiped a streak of rain from his forehead and leaned back, his entire posture shifting. The slumped shoulders of the ghost chef vanished, replaced by the commanding presence of a man used to making decisions that moved markets. "Chen is exactly who I thought he was, David," Marcus replied, his voice dropping an octave into a cold, resonant baritone. "He hasn't learned a single thing in 20 years. He still thinks money is a shield for malice." From a hidden compartment in the armrest, David handed Marcus a high-end tablet and a fresh, dry linen towel. For the last 6 months, while Marcus had been scrubbing grease and taking insults, he had also been the chairman of Miller Holdings, the private equity firm that quietly held the majority stake in the very real estate partnership that owned the pavilion's building. He hadn't just been cooking, he had been conducting a forensic audit from the inside. He had watched Chen skim off the top of the employee tip pool, he had documented the kickbacks from low-quality suppliers, and he had recorded the systematic verbal abuse of the staff. On the tablet, a series of red-flagged financial documents scrolled by, proof that Chen's empire was a house of cards built on embezzlement and unpaid debt. Marcus tapped a finger against the screen, a small, grim smile playing on his lips. "He thinks he's playing a game of checkers, but I've already removed his king," he whispered to the empty car. The realization was liberating. For years, Marcus had felt like a victim of the past, haunted by the fire in Paris and the shame of his exile. But tonight, the victim died in that alleyway. He realized that his struggle wasn't a tragedy, it was an undercover operation. He wasn't just a chef seeking a job, he was an owner preparing to reclaim his house. He thought of Sarah, the waitress who had been too afraid to speak, and the other line cooks whose spirits were being crushed daily. He wasn't going to just sue Chen, he was going to dismantle him. "What are your orders, sir?" David asked, catching Marcus's eye in the rearview mirror. Marcus looked out the window at the blurred lights of the Bay Bridge, his mind already 3 steps ahead. The anger that had boiled in his blood during the humiliation had cooled into something much more dangerous, a calculated, icy resolve. "We don't move yet," Marcus commanded. "Chen is entering that competition. He's going to spend every last cent he has on marketing and prep. He's going to put his entire ego on a silver platter for the world to see. I want him at the very top of his mountain when I pull the ground out from under him. Call the legal team. I want the foreclosure papers ready, but we don't serve them until the night of the grand opening. Marcus picked up his knife roll, tracing the worn leather. He had been a planner all his life, obsessing over the precise temperature of a sauce or the exact cut of a vegetable. Now, he was applying that same obsessive precision to justice. He wasn't going to react with a loud, messy confrontation. He was going to be the silent architect of Chen's ruin. As the car sped away into the night, Marcus felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in 2 decades. The ghost wasn't haunting the restaurant anymore. He was preparing to haunt Mr. Chen's very existence. Let him celebrate tonight, Marcus said, his voice a chilling promise. The higher he climbs, the more spectacular the fall will be. The next few weeks were a study in silent, surgical precision. While the neon lights of the Dragon's Pavilion pulsed with the frantic energy of a man convinced of his own invincibility, Marcus Miller existed in a world of quiet focus. He retreated to a private, stainless steel test kitchen in a secluded part of the city, a space where the air didn't taste of grease and desperation, but of possibility. Here, away from the prying eyes of Chen and his sycophants, Marcus began the grind. He wasn't just cooking, he was reclaiming his soul. He spent 18 hours a day over a low blue flame, refining the legacy broth, the very dish Chen's father had intended for him to master. Every reduction, every pinch of rare sea salt, and every carefully timed addition of ginger was a strike against the man who had tried to erase him. Marcus moved with a renewed vigor, his hands no longer shaking from fatigue but steady with the weight of purpose. Back at the pavilion, Mr. Chen was riding a high of pure hubris. He appeared on local morning shows, wearing a different $3,000 suit in every segment, leaning into the camera with a smug, practiced smile. He boasted about his culinary vision, and how he had personally developed the groundbreaking menu for the upcoming Global Culinary Shield. He spoke of his uncompromising standards, and how he had recently cleaned house to remove the dead weight that was holding back his genius. In the kitchen, the reality was far grimmer. Brad, now acting as head chef, was floundering. Without Marcus's secret prep notes and his uncanny ability to balance acids, the food was becoming a shadow of its former self. Chen didn't notice, or perhaps he didn't care. He was too busy ordering magnums of champagne and celebrating a victory he hadn't yet won. He truly believed he had flushed Marcus Miller down the drain like kitchen scraps. But Marcus was everywhere and nowhere. Between long hours in the kitchen, he was in high-back leather chairs, meeting with a phalanx of attorneys who looked like they were carved out of granite. He watched as they methodically bought up Chen's outstanding business loans, moving through the financial sector like a silent predator. Every time Chen took out a high-interest line of credit to fund his lavish marketing campaign, Marcus was the one quietly providing the liquidity through a dozen shell companies. He was building a cage out of gold, and Chen was walking into it with his head held high. One afternoon, Marcus stood outside a modest apartment complex on the outskirts of the city. He watched Sarah, the waitress Chen had fired for her lack of loyalty, walk out of the gate with a look of defeated exhaustion. She was clutching a stack of, now hiring, flyers, her eyes red-rimmed. Marcus didn't reveal his grand identity then. He simply approached her as a friend, offering her a position at a new venture, with a salary that brought her to tears of disbelief. He saw the flicker of hope return to her eyes, and it fueled his resolve. This wasn't just about his own revenge anymore, it was about the people Chen had trampled on his way to the top. The pieces were falling into place with terrifying alignment. Marcus even managed a private meeting with Mrs. Gable, the city's most feared food critic and Chen's wealthy neighbor. Chen had spent months trying to bribe her with rare vintages and private dinners, but Marcus brought something far more valuable: the truth. He laid out the evidence of the stolen recipes and the systematic abuse, watching as the elegant woman's expression shifted from polite boredom to icy indignation. "I've always suspected his palate was a facade," she murmured, sipping tea Marcus had brewed to perfection. "It seems it's time for a real reckoning." As the night of the competition's grand opening approached, Marcus sent one final message to the restaurant. It was an anonymous delivery, a small, silver box. Inside, resting on a bed of silk, was a single, charred truffle. It was a silent reminder of the frame-up, a ghost from the locker room sent to haunt the feast. Marcus stood in his private kitchen, looking at his reflection in the polished steel. He was no longer the stained, weary man from the alleyway. He was a man who had turned his hardship into a masterpiece of strategy. The trap was set, the guests were invited, and the trash was about to become the landlord. The night of the Global Culinary Shield Finals arrived with a suffocating sense of grandeur. Outside the Dragon's Pavilion, the sidewalk was a gauntlet of flashing paparazzi bulbs and sleek, idling limousines. The air smelled of expensive sandalwood cologne and the sharp, metallic tang of San Francisco fog. Inside, the restaurant had been transformed into a temple of excess. Crystal chandeliers cast fractured light over the city's elite, who moved through the room like colorful tropical fish in a gilded tank. Mr. Chen stood at the center of it all, the undisputed king of his own making. He was wearing a custom-tailored tuxedo that shimmered with a subtle silk sheen, a glass of vintage crystal permanently glued to his hand. He moved from table to table, his laugh loud and performative, soaking in the adulation like a man who believed he had finally cheated fate. Behind the scenes, the atmosphere was far less celebratory. The kitchen was a frantic, chaotic mess. Brad was sweating through his chef's coat, his hands trembling as he tried to manage the complex sauces Marcus had designed. The genius menu was proving too sophisticated for a man who had spent his career cutting corners. Every few minutes, Chen would stick his head through the swinging doors, his face flushing a deep, angry red as he checked his platinum watch. The judges are seated. If those plates aren't perfect, Brad, I'll have your head on a platter, he hissed, his voice cracking under the strain of his own vanity. He looked at the empty station where Marcus used to stand, a flicker of something like panic crossing his eyes before he masked it with another arrogant sneer. Suddenly, the heavy front doors swung open, and a hush fell over the room that was more dramatic than any music. Marcus Miller didn't enter through the service entrance this time. He walked through the main foyer, flanked by two stone-faced men in dark suits and a woman carrying a leather-bound legal folio. Marcus was dressed in a charcoal-colored suit that whispered of old money and quiet power, his posture as straight as a spear. He didn't look like a man who had ever scrubbed a floor in his life. The room seemed to tilt on its axis as the guests recognized the former thief they had seen being dragged out in disgrace just weeks prior. Chen's glass nearly slipped from his fingers. He stormed over, his face contorted in a mask of entitled rage. "What is this? How dare you show your face here?" Chen's voice carried across the silent room, sharp and ugly. He snapped his fingers at the security guards near the door. "Get this trash out of my restaurant immediately. He's a thief and a vagrant. Do you hear me? Throw him out." But the security guards didn't move. They stood like statues, their eyes fixed forward, refusing to acknowledge Chen's frantic commands. Marcus took a slow, deliberate step forward, entering Chen's personal space with a chilling calmness. "Your restaurant, Chen?" Marcus asked, his voice low but carrying to every corner of the room. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a gold-embossed card, laying it on a nearby table with a click that sounded like a gavel. "You've spent so much time looking down at people that you forgot to look at the paperwork. You've spent the last 6 months bragging about your vision, while I spent the last 6 months buying your debt. Every loan you took out to pay for these chandeliers? My company owns them. The lease on this very floor? I signed the acquisition papers an hour ago." The crowd gasped, a low murmur of shock rippling through the socialites. Chen's face went from a heated red to a sickly, ashen gray. He tried to laugh, a desperate, high-pitched sound that died in his throat. "You're lying. You're a nobody. You were a cook. You're just a disgruntled employee making a scene." He turned to the crowd, his hands gesturing wildly. "Don't listen to him. He's crazy. This is my night. This is my victory." At that moment, Sarah stepped forward from behind Marcus. She wasn't in her waitress uniform, she was in a professional blazer, her eyes bright with a sense of justice that had been suppressed for too long. She held up a high-definition tablet, connecting it to the restaurant's integrated media system. "The only thing that's crazy, Mr. Chen, is thinking you could get away with it forever," she said, her voice steady and clear. The giant screens that usually displayed artful close-ups of foods suddenly flickered to life with grainy security footage. The room watched in stunned silence as the screens showed Brad sneaking into the locker room with the velvet box of truffles. It showed Chen standing by the fire in Paris all those years ago, his younger face twisted in a malicious grin as he watched the flames. And then, most damning of all, the audio began to play, a crystal-clear recording of Chen in the walk-in freezer, admitting he needed Marcus to ghost cook the competition because he didn't have the talent to do it himself. The mask didn't just slip, it shattered into 1,000 pieces. The air in the room grew cold as the elite guests, the very people Chen had tried so hard to impress, began to pull away from him as if he were a leper. The stage was set, the evidence was screaming from the walls, and for the first time in his life, Mr. Chen had nowhere left to hide. The silence in the grand dining room was so absolute that the sound of a single teardrop hitting a silk tablecloth would have echoed like a gunshot. Mr. Chen stood paralyzed, his mouth hanging open as the grainy footage on the monitors looped back to the beginning, showing the younger version of himself committing the arson that had stolen Marcus's career. The smug, golden boy of San Francisco society was gone. In his place stood a man whose skin had turned the color of damp parchment. He began to tremble, his hands shaking so violently that the champagne glass finally shattered against the marble floor, the fine crystal exploding into 1,000 jagged shards that mimicked the state of his empire. "It's fake," Chen stammered, his voice thin and reedy, lacking every ounce of the venom he had used to humiliate his staff just an hour before. "That's AI. That's a deepfake. Marcus is a liar. He's trying to extort me." Marcus didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He stepped forward until he was mere inches from Chen, his eyes cold and unwavering, reflecting the flickering screens that held the truth. "My father's protégé?" Marcus whispered, the words slicing through Chen's frantic denials. "No, Chen. I'm the man who actually listened when your father taught us. He told us that a dish is only as good as the soul of the man who makes it. Looking at you now, it's no wonder the food in this kitchen has turned to ash." Marcus reached into his pocket and pulled out a single, folded piece of paper, the final notice of foreclosure and an immediate order of eviction. He tucked it into the breast pocket of Chen's shimmering tuxedo, patting it twice with a hand that was finally, completely steady. At the judge's table, the lead culinary inspector stood up, his face set in a mask of professional disgust. He looked down at the signature dish that had been served, the one Marcus had intentionally left incomplete in his notes. "This is inedible, Mr. Chen," the judge announced, his voice booming through the speakers. "It's bitter, unbalanced, and quite frankly, an insult to this competition. But more importantly, the evidence of labor abuse and fraud we've just witnessed is far more foul than the food." As the judge spoke, the heavy front doors opened once more, but this time it wasn't socialites entering. 2 uniformed officers from the San Francisco Police Department walked in, their silver badges catching the light of the chandeliers. Chen's knees finally buckled. He sank to the floor, his expensive suit bunching up around him as he grabbed at Marcus's trousers, his fingers trembling with a sudden, desperate urge to beg. "Marcus, please," he whimpered, the arrogance replaced by a pathetic, whining fear. "We were brothers once. My father loved you. Don't do this. I'll give you the restaurant. I'll give you anything. Just tell them it was a mistake." The guests watched with a mixture of horror and grim satisfaction as the man who had spent a lifetime looking down on the world was now literally crawling at the feet of the man he had called trash. Marcus looked down at him, his expression one of profound pity rather than hatred. He gently pulled his leg away from Chen's grasp. "We were never brothers, Chen. Brothers don't set fire to each other's dreams. And you can't give me what I already own." Marcus turned to the lead officer and nodded. "He's all yours, officer. There's a mountain of evidence regarding the embezzlement and the intentional frame-up of an employee on his office computer. Sarah has the keys to the server room." As the handcuffs clicked shut over Chen's wrists, the sound resonated like the closing of a tomb. The police led him out past the tables of people who had once called him a genius, and now wouldn't even meet his eye. Brad, seeing the ship sinking, tried to slip out the back through the kitchen, but he was blocked by the very line cooks he had bullied for years, their arms crossed and their faces set in stone. The mic drop was complete. Marcus stood in the center of the room, the lights of the pavilion reflecting in his eyes. He wasn't a ghost anymore. He was the owner, the master, and finally, after 20 years of living in the smoke, he was a man who could breathe again. He looked at Sarah and gave her a small, solemn nod. The dragon's pavilion was dead, but something far better was about to be born from the ruins. The dust settled on the wreckage of Mr. Chen's reputation faster than the bubbles faded in the abandoned champagne glasses scattered across the pavilion. Within 48 hours, the headlines were relentless, detailing the spectacular bankruptcy and criminal fraud of the city's golden boy. Chen didn't just lose his business, he lost his name. Every asset was frozen, every designer suit seized, and every bridge he had ever built was burned to a crisp by the very fires of arrogance he had stoked for decades. Brad, the loyal accomplice, found himself facing a series of felony charges for the frame-up, his career in the culinary world ending not with a Michelin star, but with a mugshot. 5 years later, the corner of the block looked different. The cold, sterile neon of the Dragon's Pavilion had been replaced by a warm, inviting glow emanating from a restaurant now simply called the Phoenix. The air around the entrance didn't smell of vanity anymore. It smelled of roasted garlic, star anise, and the kind of slow-simmered broth that required patience and soul. Marcus Miller stood at the pass, his chef's coat white as new snow, his movements fluid and peaceful. He wasn't a ghost anymore, and he wasn't a corporate chairman hiding in a limousine. He was a teacher. He had transformed the space into a world-class culinary academy dedicated to providing opportunities for those the world had discarded, the veterans, the single parents, and the dreamers who had been told they weren't enough. Sarah, now the general manager and a minority partner in the business, walked up to Marcus with a clipboard and a soft smile. She watched as he patiently showed a young apprentice how to properly balance the acidity in a reduction, his scarred hand steady and sure. Marcus treated every dishwasher with the same respect as his lead investors, creating a culture where the heat of the kitchen forged bonds instead of breaking spirits. He had realized that the ultimate revenge wasn't seeing Chen in a prison cell. It was building a legacy that stood for everything Chen had tried to destroy. One rainy Tuesday evening, as Marcus was locking up the back entrance, he noticed a figure huddling near the dumpsters in the alleyway. The man was wrapped in a tattered, oil-stained coat, his hair matted and his eyes hollow with the desperate hunger of a man who had forgotten the taste of a real meal. As the man turned his face toward the light, Marcus recognized the sharp features of the person who had once stood over him with a tureen of hot soup. It was Chen. He had been out of prison for a year, but the world had no place for a man with a heart of stone and a record of fraud. Chen looked up at the "Help Wanted" sign posted on the back door of the Phoenix, then looked at Marcus. For a long second, the two men stood in the same alleyway where Marcus had once been discarded like trash. Chen's lip trembled, but there was no snarl this time, only a profound, crushing shame. He looked at Marcus's clean coat and then at his own filth-covered hands. He was too broken to even ask for a handout. He turned to walk away, disappearing into the fog of the city he had once thought he owned. Marcus watched him go, feeling a final sense of closure. He didn't chase him down to gloat, nor did he offer a hollow gesture of pity. He simply understood that the scales of the universe had finally found their balance. The lesson Marcus carried with him, and the one he taught to every student who walked through his doors, was simple but profound. Power is a temporary loan, and status is a fragile mask, but character is the only currency that never devalues. You can spend a lifetime trying to climb a mountain by stepping on the backs of others, but you will eventually find that the higher you go, the lonelier the air becomes. In the end, we aren't judged by the wealth we accumulate or the people we humiliate, but by the kindness we show when we think no one is watching. Karma doesn't just catch up, it returns everything you gave to the world, with interest. So, choose to be the light in the kitchen, for the fire you light to hurt others will eventually be the one that consumes your own house.